In the half-light of the hospital room, medical equipment beeped quietly. The clock's hand on the white wall trembled slightly, counting the minutes of this endless evening. The shadows of the blinds traced the floor with uneven lines resembling the bars of an invisible cage. Through the slightly open window came the muffled hum of the evening city, so distant and foreign, as if from another life. Vera sat by her daughter's bedside, absent-mindedly stroking the limp hand lying on the pristine sheet. Just yesterday, these delicate fingers danced over the piano keys, bringing music to little students. But today, they lay motionless like wax in the sterile hospital silence. Every sound seemed especially sharp. The rustling of the medical chart a nurse flipped through, muted voices in the corridor, the rhythmic hum of machines sustaining life in the battered body. Drops of saline fell into the IV tubes, marking the seconds like sand in an hourglass, trickling from the present into an unknown future. Natalie appeared especially fragile against the backdrop of the hospital bed, like a porcelain doll carelessly tossed onto the white linens. Her pale face almost merged with the pillow. Only the bruises, where they couldn't be hidden, stood out as painful shadows, like watercolor smudges on a clean canvas. Her tangled chestnut hair lay across the pillow, just as soft and silky as it had been in childhood, when little Natalie would run to her mother in the mornings for a new school hairstyle. Vera, with 30 years of medical practice behind her, had seen a lot, yet couldn't shake the thought that the marks on her daughter's body resembled the work of someone well-versed in anatomy. Each blow was delivered to inflict maximum pain, but leave as few traces as possible. Her medical experience discerned everything. Characteristic hematomas on the ribs, a barely noticeable swelling in the forehead area, finger marks on the forearms, all indicating a brutal, methodical beating. A bouquet of Natalie's favorite flowers, white chrysanthemums, stood on the bedside table. When they were brought in the morning, they still smelled of autumn and coolness, but in the stifling hospital atmosphere they began to wilt, shedding white petals onto the sterile, tiled floor. One such petal fell on Natalie's hand, and Vera gently brushed it off, afraid to disturb her daughter even with this weightless touch. 5-year-old Alex sat nearby, gripping his grandmother's hand with the desperate strength only young children can muster in moments of fear. His grey-blue eyes, so much like his mother's, were fixed on the still face of Natalie. In that childlike, piercing gaze lay the pain that took Vera's breath away every time she met it. An unbidden memory surfaced. A similar hospital room bathed in sunlight, a happy Natalie with her newborn son in her arms, the baby's first cry. Back then, the whole world seemed to pause to welcome new life. Now it stood in horror at the violence inflicted upon this life, and now her boy couldn't utter a sound, as if grief itself had sealed his lips with an invisible seal. The sound of confident footsteps in the corridor shattered the silence. The clear, measured step of expensive leather shoes on the hospital linoleum. The doors swung open, admitting Mark, accompanied by 2 police officers. His impeccably tailored dark blue suit by a famous designer and perfectly styled hair seemed inappropriately ostentatious amid the hospital's sterility. The golden rim of the wedding ring caught the last rays of the setting sun and momentarily dazzled like a sinister smile of fate. Mark, Natalie's husband, exuded the calm of someone fully in control. "I told you it would come to this," his voice rang with perfectly rehearsed sorrow. In recent months, Natalie hadn't been herself. These mood swings, unexplained aggression. He spoke smoothly as if reciting a learned script, while his groomed hands repeatedly adjusted his flawlessly tied tie. The police officers, a young sergeant and a not-so-young captain with a weary face, were sullenly taking notes. The nurse who followed them in set down a hefty medical chart on the bedside table, containing a report from a private psychiatric clinic dated a month ago. Tendencies for self-harm, instability, The words blurred before her eyes, forming a monstrous picture of a non-existent illness. It couldn't be true. Her daughter had never consulted a psychiatrist. She would know. She would have known for sure. But the seals looked authentic, the signatures official. Even the clinic's letterhead was printed on expensive paper with watermarks. Suddenly, she felt her grandson's hand tremble in hers. Alex rose slightly, his lips moving silently as if trying to break through the dam of silence. In his widened child's eyes was such unfeigned horror that it took Vera's breath away. The boy wasn't looking at his mother, but at his father, and in that glance lay what his mute tongue couldn't pronounce, the terrifying truth known only to a small child's heart. 2 years ago, their home was awash with the sounds of music. Chopin and Mozart's melodies flowed from the open windows, mingling with the scent of blooming lilacs in the garden. On such days, it seemed nature itself paused, listening to the magical sounds coming from the windows of the 2-story house. Even the birds seemed to sing softer, as if the feathered soloists deferred to human art. Natalie taught her students in the bright living room, where sunbeams danced across the polished surface of the grand piano, creating intricate patterns of light on the walls. Little Alex, perched with a sketchbook on the wide mahogany sofa, created childish masterpieces, occasionally looking up to give his mother a beaming smile, showing an adorable gap between his front teeth. Their living room was the epitome of coziness. Antique photos in carved frames preserved the family's history. Soft velvet drapes muted the light, creating a special, almost theatrical atmosphere for music lessons. A vase of fresh flowers always stood on the coffee table. Natalie often said that music and flowers were made for each other, making the world more beautiful. In the evenings, they often made music together, Natalie at the piano, and her 3-year-old son perched next to her on the bench, entranced by his mother's fluttering hands. His clear voice repeated the words of children's songs she played just for him. In those moments, even the stern concert piano seemed to come alive, responding to the mistress's touch with a particularly warm, velvety sound. Mark, coming home from work, often found them in this activity, his face lighting up with such genuine tenderness that there seemed no happier family. He would take off his expensive jacket, loosen his tie, and join them, sitting in his favorite leather armchair. Sometimes he even requested something to be played especially for him, usually a simple Chopin waltz, the first piece he heard her play when they met. The changes began subtly, almost imperceptibly, like the first frost patterns on autumn glass. At first, these were innocent questions. Do you really need so many students? Maybe it's time to stop working. Do we need the money? Mark increasingly stayed late at his construction office, coming home with the faint scent of expensive cognac, and his smile gradually lost warmth, turning into a condescending smirk. Every day, his irritation became more noticeable. He frowned at the sound of scales from the living room, more often shut himself in his office, slamming the door. The expensive gifts he showered upon his wife now seemed not signs of love, but attempts at control. After each such gift came hints that it wouldn't be bad to start listening to him. Natalie noticed the change in her husband's gaze when he heard the sounds of music at home. It was as if something dark flickered in the depths of his grey eyes. He increasingly demanded silence, complaining about headaches after a hard day. Her students began coming less frequently. Every time, Mark found reasons why today wasn't a good day for lessons. Then he started checking her phone, frowning at messages from the students' parents. The fateful evening came after another corporate party at Mark's construction company. He came home in an odd state, reeking of expensive whiskey and cigars, his face crumpled and eyes unnaturally shiny, looking nothing like the caring husband she had known over the years. Natalie was just finishing a lesson with her last student, a little girl just starting to learn simple etudes. Alex, as usual, was sitting on the couch with his sketchbook. His favorite pencils were scattered over the velvet upholstery in a rainbow of colors. "Enough!" Mark's voice hit like a whip, shredding the cozy atmosphere of that musical evening. "You will call all the parents tomorrow and tell them you're not teaching anymore. My wife won't work as a simple music teacher. It lowers my status." The frightened student grabbed her sheet music and darted out of the room, forgetting even to say goodbye. Natalie slowly rose from the piano, feeling her knees shake. At that moment, she still didn't understand that this evening would divide their life into before and after. "Mark, but I love my work. The children enjoy working with me too." The blow was unexpected, short, calculated, almost professional. Natalie tumbled back to the piano, instinctively reaching for the instrument's lid. The keys responded with the discord of an accord, reminiscent of a scream of pain. A crystal vase with flowers wobbled and fell, shattering to pieces. Water and petals spread over the polished surface of the instrument like the first drops of an approaching storm. In the absolute silence that followed, you could hear a pencil fall onto the parquet. Alex stood frozen, his eyes wide and full of terror. His lips trembled, opened, but produced no sound, as if the air had frozen in his lungs. That's when the boy lost his voice. On his drawing, clutched in his tiny hand, the happy family of 3 stick figures was now crossed out with a long pencil line. Seeing his frozen son, Mark's expression suddenly changed. He stepped toward the boy, extending a hand. "Son, you don't understand." But Alex shrank back, continued to open his mouth silently. His eyes brimmed with tears, his fingers clenching the drawing. At that moment, something indefinable changed in Mark's gaze, as if a glass cracked, revealing his true face. He turned slowly to his wife, a strange smile appearing on his lips, freezing Natalie's blood in her veins. "You know, darling," his voice turned almost tender, sending a chill down his wife's spine, "maybe it's for the best. A mute witness is no witness at all, and who knows what might happen to a mute child. But you'd better keep your silence, dear, because children can be so careless, you'll agree." Those words hung in the air like poisonous mist, and in Mark's eyes swam something that clenched Natalie's mother's heart into an icy lump of horror. She realized this was only the beginning of a nightmare from which there was no easy escape. Her son's silence became not just a symptom of shock, but a leash by which Mark could now hold them close. After that first blow, their lives became a walk through a minefield. Mark became a master of manipulation. During the day, he showered his wife with apologies and gifts, yet at night, whispered threats. "Think of Alex," he'd say, stroking her cheek with feigned tenderness. "Who would be believed? A successful businessman or a hysterical woman who drove her own child to muteness? I have connections, money, the best lawyers. They'll easily declare you insane." During those rare days when Natalie gathered her belongings, he seemed to read her thoughts. "Run," he'd smirk, carelessly shaking out her purse onto the floor. "Just remember, you'll never see your son again. I'll find you anywhere. And if you report me, they'll say you've lost your mind, and our mute little boy will be left all alone." She stayed for her son, who now communicated only through his eyes and drawings. His albums filled with disquieting pictures, black shadows, hunched figures, smeared red blotches. One day, Natalie saw Alex hastily hide his sketchbook upon hearing his father's footsteps. In his eyes was such fear that it took her breath away. Mark methodically cut off all paths to salvation. First, the friends disappeared. He always found reasons to cancel meetings. Then, the mobile phone accidentally fell in water. He avoided talking even in shops, now traveling to a neighboring town where no one knew them. The house became a luxurious prison, each room equipped with cameras for security, as Mark explained to impressed business partners who marveled at his family care. He always hit his wife so that the marks could be hidden with clothing, And if bruises appeared in visible places, he arranged sudden business trips, taking his family where no one knew them. Vera noticed fading bruises on her daughter, long sleeves in the heat, a frightened gaze. "Natalie, what's happening?" she'd ask, but her daughter would merely shake her head. "I'm just tired, Mom." Then Mark began limiting their meetings, citing busyness and frequent trips, now always taking his wife and son. Grandma tried reaching her grandson, but Alex seemed to build a wall of silence around himself. Only his drawings screamed what was happening behind their closed doors. One day, while tidying up scattered toys, she found a hidden sketchbook under his bed. Children's drawings told a terrible story. A huge black figure looming over a small woman, red splatters resembling blood. A crying mom's face. On the last drawing, a figure with a bound mouth, Alex himself, trapped in the cage of his silence. Vera tried to take action, reaching out to the police, but Mark presented impeccable work character references, financial reports showing his generous spending on the family, even photographs from charity events where they appeared blissfully happy. "Understand," he told the district officer, "my wife is a bit unstable post-childbirth, and my mother-in-law, she's simply worried, as any mother would be." Then came what she feared most. Alex, backed into a corner after another fit of paternal rage, suddenly began gasping. He had his first panic attack. The ambulance rushed the child to the hospital, and Mark, sitting by his bed, first mentioned a boarding school. "Perhaps he'd be better among specialists," he mused, stroking his wife's cheek. "Of course, if you behave, he stays with us. But should you attempt to report anything about our family matters, it could end tragically." Later, watching her sleeping son, still pale after the attack, Natalie realized she was trapped. Mark had turned her motherhood into a chain binding her to him. Only one thing remained: to endure and wait. Await the moment when the scales would finally tip, and fear for her son's life would outweigh the fear of losing him. Vera waited too. On rare days when she could see her grandson, she discreetly collected his drawings, hiding them at home. Each drawing was a silent cry for help, evidence of the ongoing nightmare, and she understood. Someday, these children's drawings might tell the story her mute grandson could not voice. That evening, something changed in Mark's gaze. He came home later than usual, reeking of alcohol, his eyes swirling with unhealthy resolve. Natalie, tucking Alex into bed, felt a twinge of unease. Over 2 years, she had learned to detect these dangerous signs. "You haven't told anyone about our little secrets?" His voice deceptively soft as he entered. Natalie's heart went cold. Maria was her single link to the outside world, her only contact, despite Mark's bans. Sensing tension, Alex tightened his grip on his blanket. "Leave," Mark growled through clenched teeth. "We need to talk in the living room." For the first time, he really lost control. Previously, he always gauged the strength of his blows, but now it was as though he lost power over himself. Each movement fueled his rage further. The last thing Natalie remembered before losing consciousness was Alexa's terrified face in the doorway and his silently opening mouth. Vera rushed to the hospital first, immediately upon getting the call. Natalie lay entangled in wires and tubes, unconscious. The doctors spoke of extensive internal injuries, potential brain edema. "She might not wake up for weeks," the doctor cautiously warned. Mark appeared an hour later, already accompanied by a distinguished man in an expensive suit. "This is Dr. Smith," he introduced. "John Smith has long been observing Natalie and will help us sort things out." Smith emitted confidence. He produced a bulky folder of medical documents, at this point filled with records of allegedly chronic psychological issues in Natalie, her propensity for self-harm, even fabricated regular checkups over the past year. But one attending doctor suspected something. The injury's nature, their placement, all pointed to systematic abuse. Quietly, he contacted the police, and the case reached an experienced detective who didn't believe the self-harm narrative. For the first time, this horrific story came to light. A month later, as court proceedings commenced, the hall was heavy with silence. Heavy curtains created semi-darkness where the jurors' faces looked like wax masks. Mark just finished his speech full of sincere concern for his mentally unstable wife. "I always tried to help her," he said, looking at the jury with tearless, wet eyes, "but she refused treatment, then began hurting herself. I feared leaving her alone." Smith stood to testify. His conclusion read in an even professional tone, painting a grim picture. "The patient exhibits clear signs of mental disorder, a tendency toward destructive actions, aggressive fantasies." Vera, sitting in the front row with her grandson, felt shivers down her spine. The jurors nodded sympathetically, looking at Mark. Even the prosecutor seemed bewildered. All evidence was circumstantial, and neighbors' accounts of some screams drowned against the backdrop of a respected businessman's spotless reputation. As the judge announced a recess, Vera decided. With trembling hands, she produced the worn album she'd hidden in her bag all this time. "Your Honor," her voice shook, "I have evidence. Drawings. My grandson's drawings." Mark flinched for the first time during the process, his perfect mask slipping. His gaze darted to Alex, who suddenly clenched up like a small animal before a leap. The judge nodded, and the album was handed to the jury. Page by page, a terrifying story unfolded, told by a child's hand. Black figures, red stains, silhouettes cramped in pain, each drawing a silent cry for help. "These are mere childish fantasies," attempted Smith. "Such things can occur at his age." Yet then something incredible happened. Alex, silent for 2 years, suddenly jumped up. His eyes widened, seeing his last drawing, the one where a black figure loomed over a curled woman. "He did all this!" A clear child's voice cut through the courtroom's hush. "Daddy beat Mummy every night, then said he'd kill me if Mum told anyone." The hall buzzed with whispers. Shocked jurors glanced between the boy and father, but Alex, as if breaking free of 2 years of silence, couldn't stop. "He locked us up, monitored every step. Mummy cried at night, thinking I was asleep, but I heard it all. And when Grandma visited, he made us lie." Mark rose slowly, his face contorted into a mask of fury. "Traitor!" he snarled, shoving the lawyer trying to hold him. "Little liar!" He lunged at his son, sweeping everything in his path. Madness swirled in his eyes, fingers poised to grab. His hand reached for the child's throat, seemingly wishing to silence forever that voice of truth, released after 2 years' captivity. The courtroom held a deafening silence, only disrupted by labored breath and juror whispers. Court officers rushed at Mark, but he was almost upon his son. His hand reached the boy's neck when, at the last moment, an officer managed to grab and pull him back. "I'll find you," Mark rasped as they dragged him away from Alex. "You'll regret this, you little punk." "Remove the defendant," the judge's voice rang with indignation. The grey-haired woman in her robe, who'd witnessed many serious crimes over her career, appeared genuinely stunned for the first time. Mark's despair and rage betrayed him ultimately. Amid the officer's pressure, he continued to struggle like a cornered beast. John Smith, witnessing the scene, suddenly wilted as if all the air was let out of him. He slowly removed his glasses, rubbed them with trembling hands, smudges left on the expensive lenses. His respectability visibly crumbled, shoulders slumped, sweat purled on his forehead, and hands holding fraudulent papers shook noticeably. "I'm ready to testify," he quietly announced, avoiding the jury's gaze. "All documents are fake. Mark paid me to invent a medical history for his wife. I've never treated Natalie. He threatened my family if I refused." Alex still clung to his grandmother, wide-eyed at the unfolding events. His small fingers gripped her sweater, but the trembling in his body gradually subsided. For the first time in 2 years, he began feeling safe. For Vera, the following days passed in a blur. Interrogations, testimonies, paperwork, all melded into an unending stream. Then, exactly a week after the trial, news came from the hospital. Natalie opened her eyes. Entering the hospital room with Alex, the boy paused at the door. His mother looked so fragile among the white hospital linens, but her eyes now watched alertly and warmly. The boy rushed to the bed, carefully pressing against her hand, cautious not to disturb the numerous wires and monitors. "Mommy," he whispered, the simple word sounding like the most beautiful music in the world. "I waited for you." Tears rolled down Natalie's cheeks as she heard her son's voice for the first time in 2 years. Vera stood by the window, surreptitiously wiping her eyes with a starched handkerchief. Recovery was slow. Each day brought small victories. First, tentative steps down the hospital corridor, clutching the IV stand. Then, the first solitary walk in the hospital garden, where spring flowers already bloomed. During this time, Alex rarely left his mother's side, fearing she might disappear. His voice, reclaimed in court, grew more confident, though some words still came with difficulty. Vera took her daughter and grandson to her country house, away from the city with its noise and hustle. Here, among apple trees and blooming flower beds, the wounds of the past healed faster. The old house seemed to enfold them with warmth. Creaky floorboards, curtains smelling of herbs, an old piano in the corner of the living room, awaiting familiar hands. Half a year passed. A warm autumn day filled the garden with golden light. Leaves on the apple trees had started yellowing, but the air still bore the last breath of summer. Natalie sat on the veranda's old wicker chair, watching Alex play with a recently acquired puppy, an adorable fuzzy ball resembling sunshine, named Ray by the boy. "Mom, look, he loves me!" Bright child laughter echoed in the garden as the puppy licked the boy's nose, causing an explosion of happy giggles. That sincere, carefree laughter was the best proof that life was gradually returning to normal. Vera brought a tray with tea and apple pie to the veranda, an old family recipe handed down through generations. "I'm returning to teaching next month," Natalie quietly said, holding a warm cup with drawn cornflowers, her childhood favorite. The art school director called, offered a few students, saying the kids keep asking when their beloved music teacher is coming back. "And I'll draw," Alex exclaimed, settling between his mom and grandma. Ray twirled about his feet, begging for a treat. "Now with colourful paints. I'll draw us living at Grandma's, with Ray and the apple trees, and Mom at the piano." Natalie embraced her son, inhaling the familiar scent of his hair, still fragrant with summer and childhood. On the table lay his new sketchbook, filled with bright, joyful drawings. No more black figures and red spots, only sunshine, flowers, and smiling faces. A new life awaited them, free from fear and pain, filled with music, colors, and laughter. A life where children's drawings wouldn't scream for help, but tell only bright stories. A life where one could sleep peacefully, not flinch at every rustle, and talk about whatever came to mind without fear of consequences. A life veiled in pink somewhere in the distance. Birds sang, bidding farewell to the departing day. On the veranda of the old country home, 3 generations of a family who had endured terrible trials finally felt safe. Did you enjoy this story? Tell us your thoughts in the comments, give this video a thumbs up, and subscribe to the channel to not miss new releases. See you soon.